in my work on this channel, apart from issues connected to population decline and aging caused by subreplacement fertility, I also focus on the issues of the ethnic future of the West. Many Western states are undergoing very prominent and more or less irreversible changes in their ethnic composition, caused by the combination of the decline of the native populations and mass immigration from various non-European source countries. That is true for the whole of the Anglosphere as well as for the majority of Western Europe. One of the central questions regarding this issue is, what will be the endgame? No one who is serious about studying this topic can deny that the societies undergoing these processes will be fundamentally and profoundly changed. Some might welcome this change, some might consider it a catastrophe. But how exactly will this change look in the long run? In this video, I would like to analyze a country that might offer glimpses of insight into the ethnic future of the West. And that country is Brazil. With its 200 million inhabitants, Brazil is a demographic behemoth and the 7th most populous country on the planet. Brazil is also on the brink of pretty serious issues connected to aging and declining population in a not so distant future. But so far, its population structure is still pretty sweet due to the demographic dividend, and Brazil still adds around 1 million people annually to its population due to natural growth. But I want to concentrate on something else in this video. I chose Brazil because of its ethnic composition and the way its current ethnic composition came to be. Brazilian anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro classified different American societies into 3 groups. The United States, Canada, Argentina, and Uruguay are what he called the transplanted peoples. Basically, in those societies, the demographic inflow from Europe, and partially from Africa, was so massive that it just transplanted societies from the old world to new geographic locations, with relatively small genetic and cultural contributions from the native populations. Then, there are the so-called testimony societies, like Mexico, Peru, or Guatemala. Here, even though there were massive ethnic and cultural influences stemming from the colonial period, one can observe continuity with the previous civilization. And then there are the so-called new peoples, such as Brazil, Colombia, Paraguay, or Venezuela, where mixing different elements created a completely new ethnocultural entity. Before we fully dive into the Brazilian case, I want to thank one of my Brazilian viewers, who helped me tremendously with demographic data and other information for this video. The Brazilian Supreme Court has recently ordered the shutdown of X, formerly known as Twitter, in the country. Ground News found 430 sources covering this coming from across the political spectrum and the world, ensuring I get an on-the-ground perspective of every story I read. That's why I'm partnering with Ground News again for this video. They are an app and a website that gathers related news from thousands of sources around the world, so readers can compare how different outlets cover the same story, with context on their political bias, credibility, and even who funds them. I personally love using their blind spot feed, which highlights important news receiving little coverage from the left or right. It helps me step outside of my echo chamber and see stories I might have missed because of my biased news consumption. So, go to ground.news/Kaiser or scan my QR code to try them out today. My link saves you 40% on the same Vantage plan I use to get unlimited access to all their amazing features. You'd be supporting my work and an independent news platform I really trust at the same time. So, in the case of Brazil, the fusion of the 3 main ethnic elements, European, predominantly Portuguese colonizers and settlers, indigenous populations, and African slaves, through large-scale miscegenation, created a new ethnic paradigm in which the vast majority of Brazilians are to a certain degree mixed. That contrasts sharply with the New World societies populated mostly by Anglo-Saxons and other Northwestern Europeans, such as the United States, Australia, or South Africa. The roots of this contrast lie in the specific ethnogenesis of these societies. In North America and South Africa, the incoming European population was significantly more gender balanced. While in Brazil, and most of Latin America in general, the migration from the Iberian Peninsula was heavily male-dominated, composed mostly of adventurous men looking to make a fortune, while the Portuguese women were often even forbidden from emigrating. In North America, it was often whole families looking to settle the New World, and mostly live off the abundant farmland. The demographic results of this difference are clear. Incomparably higher levels of miscegenation. Miscegenation basically means mixing of populations of different ethnic or racial background through offspring. It is nowadays often considered derogatory, but since in any literature regarding Brazil it is abundantly used, I will just use it. The high testosterone Portuguese chats, lacking women of their kind, did the inevitable, had a lot of offspring with the native women as well as with the enslaved African women. That is reflected in the research of the male and female genetic lineages in Brazil, where the female line is triracial and the male line is much more heavily Portuguese. The Portuguese first landed on the Brazilian shores in 1500, and they began to enslave the native tribes for work in the sugarcane economy, concentrated in the northeast of the country. The Portuguese divided the territory into large properties, giving to their noblemen to extract resources from, and these noblemen further divided these properties between individual settlers. Now, due to the massive mortality rates of the indigenous populations due to old world diseases and wars, the supply of labor was getting scarce, and the Portuguese turned to the African slave trade to obtain more. Now, purely by a glance at a map, one can see that the northeastern tip of Brazil is geographically relatively close to Africa. The transport costs of slave imports were thus lower than in North America. And this, combined with the fact that sugarcane was a high-price commodity, meant that slave labor in Brazil was very cheap compared to North America. That had serious consequences. First of all, incredible amounts of African slaves were imported to Brazil. It is estimated that between 1500 and 1850, when the slave trade ended, 5.5 million African slaves were imported to Brazil. That is circa 45% of all the African slaves imported to the New World. For comparison, less than 400,000, or 4% of the overall number, were brought to the United States. However, due to the fact that importing slaves to the US was more expensive and cotton was a lower yielding crop than sugarcane, the American slave owners were incentivized to keep their slaves alive much more than the Brazilian ones. The mortality and fertility rates for Brazilian slaves were thus much higher and lower, respectively, than in the United States. The slave mortality in Brazil was absolutely diabolical. On a more positive note, the abundance of new slaves also led to comparatively very high levels of manumission, meaning the freeing of slaves by their owners. The comparison with the United States is once again telling in this case. In the final years of slavery, it is estimated that while in much of the southern United States, less than 5% of the black population was free, the figure ranged between 30 and 90% in various Brazilian states. That had huge consequences for the development of Brazilian society. Here, we can compare Brazil's case with that of the United States and the Caribbean. The United States imported relatively few slaves, but kept them comparatively much more alive and ensured their relatively higher fertility in order not to spend money on new ones, while granting freedom to only a minimal number of them before the Civil War, especially in the southern states where over 90% of black Americans lived until the 20th century. The consequences were the relatively low level of mixing between the black and white populations, as well as the very high cultural distance of the black Americans from their African homelands. In the Caribbean, the situation was very different. Almost 40% of all slaves imported to the New World headed to the Caribbean, even though it is a comparatively tiny area in comparison with the land masses of North and South America. The fertility of slaves in the Caribbean was very low, and their mortality was super high. That resulted in a continuous imports of new waves of fresh slaves from Africa, which then led to a much higher population of unmixed black people in some Caribbean islands, such as Jamaica or Haiti. It also resulted in relatively low levels of mixing between the populations, since very few of the Caribbean slaves were given freedom and culture that was much less disconnected from its African sources, since large proportions of the freed slaves in places like Haiti were actually born in Africa. In Brazil, the specific mix consisted of very high slave imports, a high mortality, and relatively low fertility among slaves. Nevertheless, due to the high percentage of freed slaves over the centuries, which had positive population growth and intermixed with the white population at comparatively high rates, this was one of the bases for the rise of what is now likely the biggest ethnic component of Brazilian population, the brown people, called Pardo in official census or also Moreno in the daily usage of Brazilians. However, throughout history as well as today, Brazil's African genetic and cultural influence is strongest in the northeastern coastal areas, in states like Bahia or Pernambuco, where the sugarcane slave economy thrived. Now, throughout the centuries, together with African slaves, there has been a steady inflow of Portuguese settlers who expanded settlements through the vast areas of Brazil, first as subsistence farmers, providing food for the populations working the sugarcane economy in the northeast, and simultaneously also in the southern part of the country, where colonists carried out hunts for native slaves and precious metals in the inland of Brazil. In 1695, gold was discovered in the central part of Brazil, which prompted large-scale demographic growth in the region. This gold rush attracted hundreds of thousands of Portuguese colonizers. Portugal even had to limit emigration to Brazil due to fears of depopulation in the 1720s, as well as large-scale transports of slaves from the declining sugarcane economy in the northeast to mines in the central part of the country. In 1793, the capital was moved to Rio de Janeiro. However, due to the fact that in the first 2 centuries of the colonization period, slavery was not really that profitable in the central and southern parts of the country, the relative African component of the population there was lower and the European component higher. In 1822, Brazil gained independence, but it did not encompass massive changes in the country's social structure. The demographic shifts followed the established pattern of resource extraction, so the population was shifting from the declining sugarcane and gold mining economy in the northeast and center of the country, and shifting towards the booming coffee economy in Sao Paulo and the Amazon, where the rubber boom took place. Now, the transatlantic slave trade ended in 1850. And slavery was banned in Brazil in 1888. Brazil was actually the last country in the New World to abolish slavery. As usual, this was partially motivated by moral reasoning, but also by the fact that slavery was not really that profitable anymore. And due to the beginning of industrialization in the country, Brazil had more use for skilled workers than for slaves. However, due to the widespread manumission, around 3/4 of the black and brown population in Brazil were already free at the time of the abolition of slavery. Now, just as the inflow of Africans into Brazil stopped, the last large immigration movement was gathering pace. There was the massive immigration wave from Europe to the New World in the 19th and early 20th centuries, of which Brazil was approximately the 4th largest recipient in absolute numbers, receiving about 8% of the whole inflow, or about 3.5 million people, between 1872 and 1924. For comparison, the United States received over 28 million immigrants in the same period. But let's keep in mind that Brazil was far from being the demographic behemoth it is today at the time, its population being 14 million people in 1890. So, relative to its population, Brazil did receive quite a lot of immigrants. Now, this is connected to quite an interesting episode in the intellectual history of Brazil. The 19th century was a heyday of scientific racism and various classifications of human races to qualitative categories. That was a widely shared belief at the time, reaching even Brazil's tropical shores. Most of the classic eugenists of the time believed that Africans were inferior and mixed-race individuals were degenerate. Now, that obviously presented Brazilian elites with an issue. Since a lot of the elites themselves were mixed, they thus understandably were not happy about such theories, and instead came up with their own theories, which proposed that mixing does not lead to degeneration, but to the improvement of the gene pool with the increasing share of the more desirable, so European component. Just as a trivia, in Mexico, they came up with another theory altogether, claiming that mixing actually creates the best genetic material, since the mixed individuals inherit the best genes from each side. They were thus promoting their theory of mestizo Übermensch, so to speak. Now, these theories then profoundly influenced the Brazilian immigration policy at the time, which was based on the idea of whitening, so bringing as many Europeans to settle down in Brazil as possible. Europe was going through its demographic transition at the time, and thus generated massive surplus populations that could populate the new world. Brazil ran a massive subsidized immigration scheme at the time, and together with the constant flow of Portuguese, brought in also large numbers of Italians, Spaniards, and a smaller number of Germans, Slavs, Japanese, and Levantine Arabs. These populations then concentrated in the southern part of the country. States like São Paulo, Paraná, or Rio Grande do Sul. Outside of the country's southern regions, the demographic impacts of this immigration wave were negligible. European immigration significantly declined after the First World War and gradually came to a halt around the half of the century. The proportion of the Brazilian population self-identifying as white peaked in the 1940 census. Now, Brazil underwent the rapid growth phase of its demographic transition throughout the 20th century, with its infant mortality rates significantly declining, especially from the 1940s, but its fertility rate stayed very high, around 5 children per woman, up to the 1970s. Brazil thus entered the 21st century with population 10 times larger than a century ago, and 60 times larger than 200 years ago. Now, that brings us to the question of Brazil's ethnic and racial composition. According to the 2022 census, as well as to various censuses taking place throughout history, the vast majority of Brazilians, almost 99% in 2022, self-identify as belonging to one of three categories. Pardo, meaning brown or multiracial, branco, meaning white, and preto, meaning black. Additionally, there are small fractions of people identifying as East Asian, predominantly Japanese, and indigenous. Various genetic estimations show that the gene pool of the Brazilian population is around 62% European, 24% African, and 14% indigenous. There is, of course, large regional diversity, with the European component being as high as 78% in some of the southern regions and as low as 40% in some of the northern regions. However, the most crucial fact about race in Brazil is that it is a spectrum. You have part of the population that is white on one end, part of the population that is black on the other end, and a huge spectrum of various shades of brown in between. The edges of these categories are superfluous and impossible to define precisely. It is a continuum of various levels of European heritage. How one describes himself might not always be consistent with how others see them, even though it mostly overlaps. Although it is not included in the census option, one of the terms commonly used by people is moreno, which is very ambiguous and can mean dark-skinned, dark-haired, tawny, swarthy, brown, or suntanned. When researchers gave people the option to self-describe as they want, without the limitations of categories available in the census, they find out that a significant amount of people who went for white or black category in the census would use the term moreno instead if given a choice. The way in which people self-identify might also be influenced by the current cultural atmosphere. The self-perception of these issues in Brazil underwent a massive turnaround in the first half of the 20th century. In 1929, the first Brazilian eugenics conference took place, where everybody was trying to somehow square the circle of practicing eugenics in a country where a huge part of the population was mixed to a certain extent, and applying hardcore segregationist solutions popular in parts of the US, Nazi Germany or South Africa at the time, would lead to unworkable and absurd results, like some members of the old-school wealthy Brazilian elites voluntarily putting themselves in inferior position to some German immigrants which arrived to Brazil a couple of years ago. In 1933, Brazilian sociologist, anthropologist, historian and writer Gilberto Freire published a book called Casa Grande e Senzala, or The Masters and the Slaves. In this massively influential work, the author basically puts the previously derogatory concept of miscegenation on its head and claims that it is a great virtue and a fundamental component of Brazilian identity and culture. The book performed miracles for the forging of modern Brazilian national identity. It also provided Brazilians with moral credit stemming from the comparison with the United States and the openly racially segregationist laws in the American South. In this comparison, Brazil seemed to an author as a society where racism was marginal. Now, Brazilian political classes, of course, loved these interpretations, since it allowed them to effectively deal with potential racial grievances by basically saying, guys, cut the crap, we don't do this stuff in Brazil, we have these issues sorted out. But as the 20th century was coming to an end, even Brazil started to implement affirmative action, mostly aimed at helping the black population. That often leads to absurd situations, like pairs of identical twins being classified as of different color by different affirmative action boards, even though they look completely identical, which is a testament to the subjective nature of these issues in Brazil. There are also cases of celebrities that identified as white their whole life, and then came out as black in recent years when the cultural atmosphere, undoubtedly influenced by the pan-Western ideological environment, made it more favorable. Such change can often be accented by changing outfits or making your hair curly or straight. The Brazilian viewer who helped me with this video described it as trying to fit a square, being the Brazilian ethnic situation, into a circle, being the American racial categories. While Brazil definitely has some similarities with America, the bottom of the socio-economic ladder is significantly more black than the top. It never had strong legal or cultural taboos regarding intermixing. It never experienced large-scale residential segregation, and the levels of socialization are high across racial groups, despite the high economic inequality. Instead of race being a biological concept, it is more about color and physical traits regarding outward appearances. As for intermarriage traits, they continue to rise in Brazil. They constituted 8% of all marriages in 1960, 22% in 1991, and 31% in 2010. The most common pairing is between white and brown Brazilians. Now, it is clear that demographic parallels between Latin American countries like Brazil or possibly Mexico, which I will talk about in a moment, and the West have their clear limitations. The basic outlines are just very different, from the lack of diseases killing huge swathes of the native populations, the difference between technologically superior conquerors and economic migrants, the lack of the fundamental gender imbalance observable among the Portuguese and Spanish colonizers, and many other things. The important thing to mention is that these theories propose that there won't be a major upward shift in the fertility rate of native Westerners to above replacement levels. If such a thing happens in the not-so-distant future, everything changes. And it would be obviously the best possible outcome that I would love to see. How this would look in practice is a complicated question. I harbor a relatively high level of skepticism towards the possibility of this happening in the current political, economic and ideological order. There are many possibilities, but let's put that aside for now. In the case of Brazil, the main genetic components come from two populations that are both not indigenous to South America, Africans and Europeans, with a relatively small input of the indigenous Amerindian population. In this regard, if we were to consider white populations in the West akin to the indigenous Americans in South and Central America, Mexico might seem like a more fitting example. In Mexico, the majority of the population exists on a spectrum of combinations of native and European genetic input, ranging from 38% in the northern part of the country to 81% in the southeastern region for the native ancestry, and from 11% in the southeast to 62% in northern Mexico for the European ancestry. However, in terms of how the future Western populations might actually be divided, it seems that Brazil is likely a better example, even though it is also far from perfectly accurate. Ethnic future of many Western populations being like a spectrum in which you would have some amount of white people on one end, very large mixed population in the middle, and some unmixed ethnicities on the other hand, depending on the precise immigration mix of various countries, is actually quite likely. The most obvious candidates are the countries of the Anglosphere. Continental Europe is a more complicated and stratified case. That is obviously not something that would happen overnight. We are actually in the early stages of such a process, which might take a century or more. Throughout the West, there are generally no strong cultural taboos regarding intermarriage in place among the native white majorities. There is a preference, but it is by no means rigid. In my video on Sweden, I discussed the interesting phenomenon of marriage migration, where heavily female-dominated immigration from countries like Thailand, the Philippines, post-Soviet Eastern Europe, Brazil, South Korea or China is pouring into rural Swedish regions, where there is a lack of native women due to the economic structure of those regions. That suggests that while people do have an in-group preference in mating, both cultural and genetic, when people decide between having a mate from a genetically different group and not having a mate at all, they definitely chose the former. The imperative for reproduction is stronger than the imperative for in-group preference in reproduction. It is quite likely that something similar to the Swedish case is also taking place in many other wealthy Western countries. This will likely interplay with the growing gender ideological polarization in the West. According to various polls, Western males are generally seen as desirable. They might thus often go for women from other parts of the world, who might have a more family-oriented approach than the native Western women. Intermarriage rates are influenced by many factors and are not unified for all ethnic groups. Some immigrant groups maintain strong cultural preference for endogamy, for example Pakistanis, Bangladeshis or Hindus in the United Kingdom. The size of an ethnic group is also an important factor, since small groups tend to outmarry more, just due to a smaller pool of viable partners of their ethno-religious compatriots. Another factor influencing intermarriage rates is the traditional family systems in various Western countries, as outlined by the French anthropologist Emmanuel Todt. Some family systems had fixed cultural rules on the equal inheritance between the siblings. Some left this matter entirely to the will of the individual parents, and some practiced primogeniture, so the model in which the oldest sibling inherits everything, and the others get nothing. This axis determines society's views on the equality of people in general. The basic thesis says that if you grew up in a family and culture that perceives siblings as equal, you would tend to perceive men in general as equal, even though they might be of different cultures, ethnic groups, or races. But suppose you grew up in a family that saw its offspring as unequal from the beginning, since one of them is predestined to inherit the family wealth just because it was born first, and the others will get nothing, and have to find their own fortune in the world. In that case, you are inclined to perceive inequality of different peoples, nationalities, or races as completely natural. Now, I have made several country-specific videos where I go deep into issues of intermarriage in various countries. You can click now and watch them, so I won't go into detail here. But generally speaking, the process of large-scale intermixing is well underway in the United States, especially between white, Hispanic and Asian populations. The intermarriage rate between the black and white populations is very low, even though it is also rising. It is thus quite likely that in the US, a substantial black population will remain on one end of the spectrum and a substantial non-Hispanic white population on the other end, geographically distributed mostly in the more rural, higher fertility, predominantly white states in the interior of the country. However, in between, a huge mixed population is likely to merge from the hyper-diverse metropolitan areas of California, Texas, Florida, New York, Nevada, Arizona, and so on. You can look at the candidates for the current US presidential election to see that this trend solidly intersects through political and socio-economic lines. The Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, is mixed herself, and the Republican candidate for vice president, J.D. Vance, someone who, according to my understanding, is on the more right-wing side of the Republican Party in terms of people with some actual power, has a wife of Indian ancestry. The global elite, comprising people of various ethnicities, meeting at the elite Anglophone universities, is also becoming very diverse and mixed. The other settler Anglosphere countries might follow similar trajectories, although with different ethnic mixes, reflecting their different immigration patterns. In Europe, The UK also seems to follow a somewhat similar pattern, even though it is obviously in the earlier stages of this development. While mixed-race Britons comprise only 2.6% of the population so far, they comprise 6% of school pupils, 6.5% of live births in England and Wales, and 11.3% of live births in Greater London. They will almost certainly be the fastest growing group going into the future, since as the very diverse youngest cohorts of Brits grow older, there will be a higher chance of intermarriage, purely mathematically, due to the distribution of possible partners. The white and black Caribbean coupling is the most common combination, followed by the white and East Asian and white and black African combinations. So the final mix in the UK might theoretically look like a white population on one end, a mixed population consisting of various degrees of white, black and East Asian admixture in the middle, and some unmixed populations mostly from the Indian Peninsula on the other end. In continental Europe, the biggest candidate for this scenario is undoubtedly France. France is a country where the egalitarian family type was the most influential one, which, according to Todd, influences the assimilationist and inclusive approach of French people towards immigrants, expressed, among other things, by high rates of intermarriage, as well as the prevalence of universalist ideas in the French intellectual tradition. Due to the state ban on collecting such data, we do not have anywhere near as detailed data on ethnicity from France. Still, sociological surveys suggest that levels of intermarriage in France are probably the highest in Europe, and one of the highest in Western world, especially between the native, North and Sub-Saharan African populations. Another heavily ethnically changing country with a prevalence of this family type is Spain, where the available data suggest high levels of intermarriage as well, especially between Spaniards and Latin American immigrants. That contrasts sharply with Germanic Europe, where the available data suggests significantly lower intermarriage rates. That might be partially due to the particularist and egalitarian family system prevalent in Germanic Europe. Germany has a historically relatively poor record of assimilating other European ethnicities compared to universalist powers like France or Russia. It never managed to successfully Germanize various Central and Eastern European ethnicities, even though it often culturally and economically dominated them for centuries. In Switzerland, the German-speaking majority never managed to absorb the French and Italian-speaking minorities. On the other hand, various smaller nations with the unegalitarian family type, such as Basques, Catalans or Irish, proved notoriously hard to assimilate. Another reason is the much more pronounced language barrier caused by the fact that most Germanic languages are not prevalent outside of Europe, unlike English, French or Spanish. Now, to somehow conclude, I would say that a certain degree of ethnic Brazilification is the most likely outcome in a number of Western countries, even though it is by no means certain to happen, and it will be a bumpy road. What needs to be taken into account is the fact that large-scale immigration of non-European ethnicities into Western countries is still a very new phenomenon from a historical point of view. Almost all of it happened in the past 60 years, and the bulk of it in the past 30 years in many countries. To use the Brazilian case for comparison, we would be somewhere in the second half of the 16th century in Brazil. The current outcome might not have looked nearly as likely back then, and there were numerous military conflicts between the declining native tribes and the colonizers. And there is, of course, a major difference in the fact that in Brazil, two large groups of newcomers merged into the new ethnocultural group, while in the West, newcomers are entering an already deeply established ethnocultural groups that, even though they are withering away through natural decline, won't meet the fate of Native Americans steamrolled by the demographic and civilizational power of the newcomers and wiped out by diseases. They would likely constitute the new mixed population's prevalent genetic and cultural component. In this way, to use the classification by Darcy Ribeiro mentioned in the introduction of this video, Western countries' future might be closer to what he called the testimony societies, like for example Mexico, with clear continuity with the previous ethnocultural forms, then to new peoples like Brazil,